It's astonishing. It's almost impossible to understand that the man who was prime minister over Israel's worst catastrophe, worst security catastrophe, a terror attack that killed over 1,000 people, that 6 months later he's still in the saddle and there's no clear um, substitute for him. So he's very weak, and at the same time, he's quite strong.
Tens of thousands of protesters gathered in front of the Knesset yesterday for what some Israeli media reports say is the largest protest in Jerusalem since the outbreak of the Israel Hamas war. And Benjamin Netanyahu's office said he's in excellent health after the Prime Minister had surgery to remove a hernia on Saturday. We're joined now by Noga Tarnopolsky, a correspondent in Jerusalem. Good morning, Noga.
Hello, good morning.
Lots to discuss. Let's begin, first of all, with the condition of the Israeli Prime Minister. Benjamin Netanyahu underwent hernia surgery. What is the latest on that?
Well, the latest is that the surgery was successful. It lasted, I think, just a little over an hour and a half, and that he's on his way to recovery. Although we have to say that Netanyahu, unlike every other Israeli prime minister, has refused to release his health records. So there's a lot of mystery about what actually is happening to him and why he would have had what he called a routine medical exam on a Saturday night, where, according to his statement, this hernia was found.
Do we have any idea how long he's going to be out of action for?
Um, we don't know. They haven't released his time of convalescence, although he's conscious, we were told, and he's engaging with, those around him. So he's back in the saddle as prime minister, and he was just replaced for about 2 hours by the justice minister when he was under anesthesia.
I mean, let's face it, he has a lot on his plate at the moment. And then over the weekend, we've seen these huge protests in Jerusalem. Just give us a sense of the scale of them.
Well, at least 100,000 people came out last night in Jerusalem, and there were further protests in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, all over the country. And these are protests directly against him and his rule and his handling of the war. This is the first time Israel has seen such massive protests since the war began on October 7th. But it has to be said that until October 7th, there were protests of this magnitude and much greater every weekend because of Netanyahu's efforts to pass what he called a judicial reform.
How perilous would you say his personal political position is, Noga? Because people have talked about threats to Netanyahu's leadership for months now. I remember in the immediate wake of the October the 7th attacks, people were saying he might be gone by Christmas. Well, here we are in April, and of course he is the great survivor of Israeli politics. But how much threat is he under?
Well, you've just asked the question for Israeli politics. He's under a lot of threat. He's a terribly unpopular prime minister. His popularity hovers just under 20% right now. He's never been a popular prime minister, but he's always been someone, as you've just alluded to, who knows how to patch together, unlikely and difficult coalitions and somehow kind of bulldozer through Israel's, I would say, fractious political parliamentary system. It's astonishing. It's almost impossible to understand that the man who was prime minister over Israel's worst catastrophe, worst security catastrophe, a terror attack that killed over 1,000 people, that 6 months later he's still in the saddle and there's no clear um, substitute for him. So he's very weak, and at the same time, he's quite strong because there's no clear path for him to move along.
Is there any prospect of elections anytime soon, early elections?
That's what the hundreds of thousands of protesting Israelis are demanding. Their two slogans are elections now and bring the hostages back home. Netanyahu has been damaged by many, many things, but most recently by the perception that he himself is an obstacle to a deal that would be that would bring the whoever's still alive among the Israeli hostages held by Hamas would bring them home. And this weekend, the tones really got sharper, I would say, from the families of hostages. They're now accusing him really directly of stopping or putting a limit to the negotiations and yet continuing the war as a way of retaining power. And that's a very serious accusation to which he hasn't really responded.
Well, let's talk about ceasefire negotiations because an Israeli delegation arrived in Cairo yesterday to resume them. How close do you think we could be to a deal, Noga?
It's hard to say, and I'm obviously not in the negotiations room, but the claims of the family members, and they really do have information from Israeli intelligence sources, is that we're not that close, in part because Netanyahu refuses to give his negotiation teams the authority to really make any deals. It's important also to say that Hamas, the terror group that took these Israelis, they too have they didn't even send a delegation this time, and they've refused to accept any deals proposed by any of the mediators that are principally, Qatar, Egypt, and the Americans. So there seems to be recalcitrance on both principal sides, but the Israelis are really accusing the Israeli prime minister specifically of almost sabotaging these talks.
And just finally, Noga, today the Israeli military is going to begin to draft members of the Orthodox community into the army. Until now, they have been exempt. What is the significance of that?
It's a huge significance, and I don't know that they will begin drafting them today, but under the law, they must. What happened is that um, due to historic, kind of tribal agreements in Israel, ultra-Orthodox young boys and girls have not been drafted to the army the way others have been. But that's never been enshrined in law. When Netanyahu returned to power in January 2023, he promised his ultra-Orthodox partners that he would enshrine it in law. Other things in the end took precedence. And what happens is that the kind of temporary arrangement that was holding that together ended, and the government, as of today, is going to be forced not only to draft all of these young ultra Orthodox people, but is prohibited under the law from transferring any funding to the religious seminaries where they study if they don't go to the army. So this is a huge revolution in Israel. It's caused a very violent response now over several weeks in the ultra Orthodox communities, and it's difficult in the current kind of almost political anarchy Israelis are living through. It's difficult to say how this one will also impact.